This lecture turns to Chinese art after 1279 and the Mongol invasions, with the Yuan and Ming dynasties. Now, with the evolution and history of Chinese art, we've seen that we've transitioned from the mythocentric, where we show the supernatural world, to the religious images and human actions being dominant, with Confucianism and Buddhism seen in the center, to the adoption of this philosophical aesthetic that avoids the human condition and shows it instead through the ideals, through symbolism, such as with Neo-Confucianism. The Song dynasty is going to move the court south, and the invasions from those barbarian, as they called them, invaders, are going to make the Chinese quite introspective and wanted them to define the qualities of exactly what it meant to be Chinese, hence Chineseness, as we would translate. Then they are going to decide that Chineseness as the characteristics are going to be defined by something that is gentle, erudite, and sophisticated, that the outsiders were in fact barbarians. They were crude, wild, and uncivilized. These barbarians who were uncivilized would in fact conquer all of the Eastern world under Genghis Khan, who led these nomads in the steppes of Asia to conquer all of China, India, South Asia, the Middle East, all the way to Eastern Europe. Thus, the Mongol Empire, made up of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, India, China, and Korea, was massive, the largest the world had ever known, even larger than Alexander the Great's empire. It was at this time that the Yuan Dynasty was founded by the grandson of Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, who would live between 1215 and 1294, proclaiming himself Emperor of China. The political and cultural centers, however, were going to be separate under the Mongol rule, for the Mongol capital was Beijing in the north, while the cultural centers of arts and poetry and of this type of production were in the south, as they were in the Song dynasty. The scholar class, known as literati, otherwise pronounced Wenren in the Chinese tradition, had an examination system to recruit government officials that would have been instituted in the Tang dynasty. Thanks to Confucianism, these Wenren, or literati, believed they should fulfill their obligation to the world, but also, following Taoism, that they would retreat from society to nature, understanding the universe, and writing poetry, painting, and gardening. Hence, the scholarly trio of production was calligraphy, poetry, and painting. This was seen to be related to social status, that being the imperial status at court. For one did not paint for income, it was an amateur ideal, for it is personal expression, more than that of professional skill. The belief is that professionals are tainted by money, therefore they produce painting to please others, instead of a genuine artistic expression. Kublai Khan would himself set a distinction between the official court taste at the Mongol court of the Yuan and the literati taste. The Mongols would abolish the civil service examinations and give government positions previously reserved for these scholars, these literati, would give them to other Mongols and their allies. Thus scholars turned inward and began expressing themes in symbolic terms. It was at this time that we find Marco Polo, who's going to be living at Kublai Khan's court for 17 years, recording the art patronage and the massive building projects, even though they were rejected and dismissed by scholars in China. We find that he records them in a description of the world of 1300, which leads to further exploration by the West. The different formats that we see in painting in the Yuan Dynasty are going to continue from earlier traditions of scrolls, now looking at hand scrolls, hanging scrolls. Hand scrolls are going to be those that are held in the hand and unrolled by section. They would be unrolled only on occasion in which you would have a gathering or sharing them with a close friend. A hanging scroll is going to be seen unfurled on the wall, displayed for a limited time, then rolled up for storage. Now, Meng Fu is going to be a descendant of a Song painter, calligrapher, and poet, and served in the Yuan government. Meng Fu would be very influential for later artists. Here we have his autumn colors on the Chao and Hua mountains from 1296, a hand scroll that would be read and seen from right to left. Here we find that the shifting perspective is going to illustrate how you would unroll section by section the scroll from right to left. It has been through many different collections, thus we have these various stamps, colophons, and poems that are written on it, regardless of their understanding of space. If we compare it to earlier examples, we still have these various sections that we would view in tandem, in this case 3 different sections of this scroll. The style is going to be reminiscent of the archaic and old-fashioned style of the elegant Tang Dynasty, which is showing China's nostalgia for the distant past in which there was military and cultural power. Now, literati painting is going to literally translate the spirit of antiquity, has, as by definition, unassuming brushwork, subtle colors, or only in black and white, and use as subjects landscape as personal messages, usually for a close friend, not for a wide audience. Now, Qichang is going to produce in his Rongxi studio the ideas preserved by Zhao that we just saw, which of course is going to be the most famous painting entirely in ink. Now, the Chinese landscape is going to be made up of several motifs, specifically mountains, rivers, waterfalls, trees, rocks, temples, and boats. Compared to Meng Fu, we see that Zhan is going to reduce his approach even further as far as detail is concerned, using a kind of dry brush technique and leaving open more broad areas of negative space. Carrying on the vertical tradition that we saw with Fan Quan, the travelers among mountains and streams, we do move from the lower rocky outcropping to the trees and the structure in the midground, and then we have separated this body of water and another mountain in the background. However, it is less descriptive with these broader areas of empty space that are much more suggestive. They are not defined. We do not spell out what is here. This is going to be compounded by the use of the dry brush technique, where we find that the brush is lightly inked and then let run out, whereby the paper is going to let breathe. We see the white coming through even the inked areas, through the ragged strokes. So this is going to carry on that type of Zen Buddhist approach we saw with Gui here and others in the Song Dynasty. Shown in this example, you let the brush run out of ink or pigment, and so you let the paper show through, so it's much more suggestive. This technique would be adopted by many later painters, as it is seen central to the literati mode of painting and style. Now, this particular artist, Zhan, is going to have quite eccentric behavior and will be very influential, for we know he was quite wealthy and notoriously clean. He washed himself several times a day and even had his trees washed. At the end of his life, he gave away all of his possessions, becoming a hermit. This would serve as a model for serious literati or scholarly painters, for he was a gifted scholar who was too refined for the world of government service. Thus he left and lived the life of a recluse. Now, the Ming Dynasty, following the Yuan in 1368 to 1644, is going to be founded by a poor, uneducated peasant who rises through the army ranks helped by these literati scholars. However, once the Mongols were driven from Beijing, the emperor distrusted these intellectuals. Under his despotic rule, he reinstated the civil service examinations, thus bringing the scholars back into government service, but they were still alienated from power. It is at this time that we have a further differentiation between the scholarly literati painting and the official style of court. Yin Hong here, with hundreds of birds admiring the peacocks in the Ming Dynasty, shows us this type of luxurious world of court as contrasted by the literati. This court taste shows us the birds and flowers genre painted on silk, a very luxurious subject, style, and technique. This is a large format painting. It is massive by comparison for these earlier ones we were looking at. It is refined and detailed. It is colorful. This is the opposite of the small, intimate, austere, suggestive, and personal literati paintings that we just looked at, like the Rongzi Studio. Instead, we have the symbolism here, one that reinforces the respect for the imperial court and state. For the symbolism is birds showing homage to peacocks because they are superior to these birds, who lack this type of elaborate plumage. This is also meant to be understood as the homage of officials at court for the imperial state and the emperor himself. Now, Dai Jin, in his returning home late from a spring outing, is going to represent literati painting that continued in the south at the same time in the Ming Dynasty as these very elaborate courtly paintings are being produced. The Z style, which is considered to be bold and less constrained, is going to be very popular in the literati south. So again, the large format, refined, detailed, and colorful paintings of court are going to find the rejection in the South as they set themselves apart from the seemingly foreign style as the Chinese scholars would see it, to something that is distinctly Chinese. So here we find that developing this tradition of vertically oriented landscapes, we have the human world below moving in a Neo-Confucian fashion up to the mountains obscured in mist above. Only now we do have the small diminutive figures below, as can be seen crossing this bridge in Jin's example of returning home, that then transitions to these areas obscured by fog until the mountains rise above. So a similar composition, yet more asymmetrical and much more suggestive. This is going to be taken from Zong's dry brush technique with the Rongzi Studio, a very influential painting, for we can see the type of craggy trees, the brush strokes that leave exposed the white of the paper behind. And we can see how this is influenced by the Buddhist tradition, the Zen Buddhist tradition we talked about in the Song Dynasty, whereby we have asymmetrical compositions that are suggestive, leaving us to move from side to side in a diagonal. This would become the model for Korean and Japanese artists to follow that are interested in this literati approach, which is much more expressionistic and less defined. Now at court, we have Qiu Ying here, who was the preeminent professional painter who would inspire generations of imitators of court painters in the Ming and Qing. Here we have the section of Spring Dawn in the Han Palace, which is a hand scroll at about 1 feet and 18 inches. The subject here is going to be of women at court that are engaging in various pastimes. This is not new. This goes back through the 6 dynasties period and is going to be a very popular subject of court life, just as it was in South Asia. Now, they play music, they practice calligraphy and paint, all the same activities one would expect men to take up in court. We have them dancing with the sleeves, with their sashes swirling here, almost like a whirling dervish. The landscapes in the foreground are the counterpart to the mountain and water paintings, where the immortals dwell in this Confucian understanding. The ladies back here are related to these vessels, as their refined taste is reflected in them. While they play very refined instruments, they unwrap a zither, the most respected instrument in China. Another one plays the pipa. So what we have here is an antique subject matter, a very established old-fashioned subject matter, combined with a very refined technique and brilliant colors. This should remind us of the Mughal period in India and the Muslim paintings that we saw that show caliphs and rulers at court and with women. It should also remind us of this because of the isometric projection that will retain the true dimensions and does not have parallel lines receding or orthogonals proceeding to a vanishing point. So with this, in the West, we use proper linear perspective, whereby these parallel lines are going to converge, thus distorting geometric forms. Instead, the Chinese, as well as those in South Asia and in Islam, prefer the isometric projection, which is at a bird's eye view looking down on the scenes, and keep these lines parallel. Turning to porcelain, in Ming China, we have this being made world famous thanks to Marco Polo, and the Kaolin white clay fired at 1300 to 1400 degrees Celsius that will then fuse into this translucent ceramic that is a product that is incredibly strong, and the process being jealously guarded for centuries as to exactly how these were made. Here we have a flask of the Ming Dynasty from around 1426 to 35, which has the characteristic blue and white wares, which is the most famous in Chinese ceramics. Here we have the dragon, the symbol for royalty under the Qing dynasty as well, symbolizing potent auspiciousness and powers with control over water, rainfall, typhoons, and floods, while also being a symbol of power, strength, and good luck. Now, the dragon can be found in the blue and white wares on multiple objects that are going to be traded throughout the southeast section of Asia all the way to Western Europe. For as we discussed, they are a status symbol and a symbol of power, for they were embedded within various structures like the mosque and the minaret here we talked about in Indonesia. Now, the Mongols laid out their capital city according to Chinese principles that they are going to find in Beijing. So Chang'an is a walled city which was the previous capital of the Tang and was organized on a grid with streets that run north to south and east to west. In Beijing, we find this taken as a model and applied to what is now known as the Forbidden City, where we find a rectangular city is built on a grid, with the palace complex in the north, where the Mongol officials officially lived and worked, and the city of the Chinese commoners to the south. Now, the Ming and the Qing would both preserve this division. Yongle, who ruled from 1403 to 24, would be the third Ming emperor who largely rebuilt the city as we see it today. It is surrounded by moats and towers, making it easily defensible, and is also going to be modeled on Southeast Asian temples like that at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, that is also surrounded by moats and accessible by one bridge. Now, just like this, as we enter this series of terraces and walking over bridges, so too do we access the Forbidden City. We enter through the Meridian Gate, which is in a horseshoe-shaped design, which transitions us from the Chinese commoners in the south, seen here in the lower section of the city, to the interior, which is guarded by a moat, where the Mongols are actually located. Now, the perpendicular side wings are much like that of Versailles, making them easily defensible and raised above this platform, and forming this very clear entryway to the city. Once inside, we have a courtyard that is crossed by a bow-shaped waterway spanned by 5 arched marble bridges. This is significant because the number 5 in China represents the elements of nature, specifically that the earth has achieved stability through this type of balance of the various elements. The gate here of supreme harmony is going to be the next section that we would then enter as we are going to move progressively to the higher and higher ranking officials. Past these bridges of the Gate of Supreme Harmony, we're opening onto a larger courtyard with 3 ceremonial halls on raised platforms. The center, seen here, the Gate of Supreme Harmony. Now, we find moving through and past these symbols of royalty, these lions, which is common around the world. We see that we would have the emperor finally in the Hall of Supreme Harmony sitting on a throne facing south, overlooking everything that is below him. This also represents the structure of the universe and heaven. Here is the throne room, so that symbolically and spiritually, supernaturally, and divinely, we find the emperor, who is the son of heaven, looks down on the world. Flanking the central hall of supreme harmony, we have the central harmony hall and protecting harmony hall. Now, reflecting the universe, we find the emperor is the son of heaven. Thus, he maintains cosmic order from the throne in the middle of the world, symbolically represented here by this city, which is a microcosm of the world. So this heavenly city is the microcosm. Just like the microcosm and the macrocosm that would be reflected through the Buddhist understanding of the mandala. The mandala, or cosmic diagram, would show the universe as it is designed, moving centrally outward with a radiating series of circles and squares. Now, the Han would also summarize their worldview, having heaven above, earth, and then the underworld. And so we must understand this organization in order to be reflected in the design for the Forbidden City, which then moves us from heaven down to earth and finally to the underworld. So what we have here is a city that represents heaven on earth, just as the Amitabha Buddha would be represented earlier as representing in the Tang Dynasty heaven on earth with Tang buildings and structures. Turning to literati painting in the south, we have Shinzu, who's going to be the dominant literary painter, whereby in the Ming period, having no desire for government service, we attempt to then recapture the spirit of the Yuan painters, these earlier literati painters who adopted a much more expressionistic approach. Here in Shenzu's Poet on a Mountaintop, we have a very influential type of painting and a motif that he himself invents. For we have not a vertically oriented painting, but part of a hand scroll, reading it from right to left, with this invented motif of a poet surveying a landscape on top of a mountain plateau, overlooking the clouds. The poem next to him reads, "White clouds like a scarf enfold the mountain's waste. Stone steps hang in space, a long, narrow path. Alone, leaning on my cane, I gaze intently at the scene, and feel like answering the murmuring brook with the music of my flute." Now, what we have here is the dry brush technique that we talked about earlier by Zahn has now been used to understand and materialize the understanding of the literati himself and what he represents in his process. So now we have the similar amateur technique with very individualized brushwork that is also informal, relaxed, and very straightforward. So previously, we should note that landscape had dominated the figures. They were very tiny, diminutive, swallowed in the vastness of nature. Now, what is interesting is the poet dominates the clouds beneath him. And in many of these works that Zhou is responsible for, that are going to show these various poets in nature. So we find that this reflects the understanding in the Ming philosophy that the mind, not the physical world, is the basis for reality. We can also see this in the actual gardens and structures commissioned by and built by these literati. Here we have the so-called humble administrator's garden, or the garden of the cessation of official life, from the Ming Dynasty, built in the early 16th century. Here we find that literati would surround their homes with gardens that are characteristically 1/3 covered with water and dotted with pavilions, kiosks, studios, and corridors. Thus they are to understand nature by reflecting on it. Turning now to Don Qichang, we have this artist who is incredibly official, the most influential literati painter ever. He is a high official for the Ming and is a poet, calligrapher, and a painter who values expression over formal likeness. He develops, in fact, the history of Chinese art just as Giorgio Vasari would develop the history of Italian Renaissance art. As Don Qichang states, painting into two. From the northern section where the royal palace is going to be located and the central government is located is defined as being conservative and traditional, whereas the southern style of painting is considered to be unorthodox, radical, and innovative. Therefore, the northern style of painters are considered professional painters. They are producing work for patrons. They emphasize their technical skill, whereas those in the south are progressive. They use ink freely with their brushwork and are going to be producing things for their own personal expression, using poetry very often to accent their work. Now, as he stated in his history and his writing, one should read 10,000 books and walk 10,000 miles. What that means is one should study the great masters and then nature. That self-expression is the key, not the resemblance of one subject to reality. So expressionism is important, not realism. Now this relates to the literati of a relationship between painting and calligraphy, for they believe painting is calligraphy. For the closer it comes to the latter, the better it is. Thus the critical terms in Chinese art are borrowed from calligraphy. Terms such as open and closing, rising and falling, void and solid. These come from the descriptions of writing and are then applied to art and or painting. So here we're going to have the Qingbang Mountains that are going to be shown by Don Qichang. And if we compare that to earlier examples, we can see how it is different. The inscription does state that it's based on a 10th century Dongyuan painting. However, the style is quite different. The space, for instance, is ambiguous. The elements are compressed to the surface. Thus, we have this understanding of spatial compression. So you find that everything in the background seems as far away as the foreground because of the use of chiaroscuro and the various shading techniques that Don Qichang utilizes. The elements like trees and rocks are just as easily legible as semi-abstract forms instead of realistic representations of something in the real world. The elements, in fact, can be read both two-dimensionally and three-dimensionally. For the foreground trees are going to echo the midground and background trees. They're the same tree repeated without any shadows or any other elements to highlight where they are in the painting. Thus, we have this notion of double reading being very influential for Don Qichang's painting. Foreground collapses into background. They are both at the same time. He does not attempt to show topographical accuracy in his paintings, for here we have a photograph of the Qingbang Mountains that show us this peak does not exist. It is much flatter, and the different topographical elements are nowhere near how Don Qichang is going to represent them. So what we find is that he believes one should study past masters, as in this example, but add one's own personal expression to make it your own. Therefore, we find this expressive abstract style will be very influential for Korea and Japan, where we find the religious aspects of it and the aesthetic aspects are brought together. Next time, we'll continue on in the Qing Dynasty and the modern period with China and Korea.